Believe it or not, there's a lot of people who don't like Tears of the Kingdom. There's obviously a lot of reasons that people don't like Tears of the Kingdom, and I'm not here to tell you that you need to or that you shouldn't like Tears of the Kingdom. In fact, there's only one sentiment that I'm here to talk about, and it's a reoccurring comment that I see on my YouTube videos. There's a lot of people who don't feel like Tears of the Kingdom or Breath of the Wild are real Zelda games. Now, to be clear, I don't agree with this sentiment, but I do understand where people are coming from. Tears of the Kingdom and Breath of the Wild are very different from what people traditionally expect when playing a Zelda game. That being said, there is another comment that I got somewhat recently where someone said that they don't like Skyward Sword because it just didn't feel like a Zelda game. You didn't feel like Skyward Sword was a Zelda game. I don't know what kind of bizarro world you have to be living in where Skyward Sword isn't a Zelda game. However, while I was raging and fuming and thinking about this, I was reminded of an earlier argument where people were arguing that Ocarina of Time wasn't a real Zelda game because of how different it was from A Link to the Past. Now, at this point, it's pretty obvious what people are actually doing here. They're saying that one thing is different from another thing because they want to separate something they don't like as far as possible from something that they do like. It's just one of those quirky little things that people do because after all, there isn't an actual definition for what makes a Zelda game a Zelda game. In fact, it would be such a complicated question that you'd have to be insane to try and figure it out. Now, in order to figure out which Zelda game is the most Zelda game, we need to find a way to measure how Zelda a Zelda game is. In other words, we need to find a set of criteria that they can be measured against so they can be sorted from least Zelda to most Zelda. In order to be able to measure this, we need to have some sort of value that can be found factually. So subjective stances like whether or not it feels like a Zelda game are no good here. We worked with facts and numbers, not feelings. At least in this video. Because of this, I've created several categories that we can measure the games with. These categories are building blocks, structure, and presentation. I'll break down each of these as we approach them. And yes, by the end of this video, we will have an answer for which Zelda game is the most Zelda, and maybe along the way, we can determine whether or not Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom count as Zelda games. To begin, we'll be looking at building blocks in Zelda games. These are the pieces that are used to construct the world of The Legend of Zelda. This includes things like characters, items, enemies, dungeons, or locations. Basically anything that a developer would reach for when trying to make a Zelda game. This doesn't include game mechanics like durability or magic meters. We'll be covering that in a different category. We're trying to determine which games these characteristics pop up the most in. So I made a spreadsheet including 294 of these building blocks. This lets us see how often they show up in each of these Zelda games in order to see which Zelda game has the most of these building blocks. I only included these if they appeared in at least 2 Zelda games. That way we don't have games winning just because they have way more enemies than other Zelda games. These have to be reoccurring elements. I was able to find some interesting trends across this list. For example, Octoroks show up in more Zelda games than Princess Zelda. Also, the Fairy Queen, which some of my audience doesn't even know who that is, appears in just as many Zelda games as the Great Deku Tree. There's also the fact that Tingle hasn't been in a single Zelda game in 20 years. If we go based off of this list, we can start ranking Zelda games by how many reoccurring elements they have in them. From last place to first place, we have the following. We have Zelda 2 with 33 reoccurring elements, Four Swords with 40, Spirit Tracks with 50, Triforce Heroes with 50 as well, Skyward Sword with 52, Breath of the Wild with 57, Phantom Hourglass with 65, Tears of the Kingdom with 66, Zelda 1 with 67, Echoes of Wisdom with 76, Four Swords Adventure with 78, Twilight Princess with 85, Link's Awakening with 87, Minish Cap with 88, Wind Waker with 90, Majora's Mask with 95, Oracle of Ages with 95, Oracle of Seasons with 96, A Link Between Worlds with 115, A Link to the Past with 125, and in first place we have Ocarina of Time with 127. Just as a note, if you combine Ocarina of Time and A Link to the Past and the elements that occur in these, it makes up 69% of all of the reoccurring elements across the Zelda universe. It makes sense since so many Zelda games take inspiration from these two. This part of the franchise is really just a starting point, because it really doesn't matter what you have in a Zelda game if it doesn't play like a Zelda game. You could take a Mario game and put as many Bokoblins in it as you want, but it's still a Mario game and not a Zelda game. Because of this reason, we need to determine how each Zelda game plays through its structure. This is the part of the video where we determine how the player interacts with the game and what mechanics are the most Zelda out of all of them. For example, is it open world or linear? Is there a magic meter? You get the point. This category is likely what's responsible for what makes a Zelda game feel the most like a Zelda game. How we'll determine this category is we'll find the average answer for each of the subcategories within it, and then every Zelda game that has this element in it, they'll get 1 point, while the ones that do not have this element do not get a point. Then we can just rank them based on the total points that they have. In order to do this, we need to create a list of as many game mechanics that occur frequently in the Zelda franchise. This list is going to include the following: puzzles, combat, perspective, dungeons, dungeon order, and magic, and finally minigames, steeds, and items. So let's start going down this list. First, let's categorize puzzles. Instead of going through and individually categorizing every single puzzle, we can take a look at what the puzzles are trying to accomplish in the game. Many Zelda games operate on a progression-based puzzle system. You have to complete puzzles before you're allowed to move on within the game. This could apply to dungeons or in the overworld. And I don't need to go over every single Zelda game to know that this style of puzzle mechanic occurs more than the open-ended puzzle mechanic that we see in some of the later games. So that would be 1 point for every Zelda game that has a progression-based puzzle system, and then 0 points for the games that have a freedom-based puzzle system. Just for time's sake, I'm going to be compiling all of these points at the end, and I'll show you the results after we go through each category. Next up, we have combat in Zelda games. This part makes my life easier because almost every single Zelda game operates on a swing your sword at the bad guys until they're dead system. In fact, the only Zelda game that falls outside of this category would be Echoes of Wisdom, where Zelda just uses Pokemon instead. The most variety we might see outside of Echoes of Wisdom is Skyward Sword, where it has really precise motion controls to swing the sword, but ultimately it's still the same combat. You just swing your sword, it just takes a little bit longer. Now, the next category would be perspective. There's 3 kinds of perspective in the Zelda series. You have side-scrollers, top-down, and 3D. If you're cool, like a Link Between Worlds, then you can just have all 3 of these. Top-down is quite a bit more popular than 3D Zelda games, as there's 13 top-down Zelda games as opposed to the 7 third-person 3D Zelda games. This gives a point to all Zelda games that are primarily top-down. The Adventure of Link uses side-scrolling the most, but there's other Zelda games that also use side-scrolling, like Link's Awakening, or Echoes of Wisdom, or Hollow Knight. Now we have dungeons. Does the game have dungeons? If yes, that's a point. If no, no point. They do not have to be good dungeons. Now, this means a structure that is separated from the overworld, that's filled with puzzles and is mandatory for story progression. In this case, every single Zelda game has dungeons except for Four Swords and Triforce Heroes. Triforce Heroes does have places that are called temples, but they operate the exact same way as any other level does, and they don't even really change theming that much, which makes me reluctant to include them in this category. Even Four Swords Adventure treats their dungeon levels very differently, with small keys and puzzles to progress through the dungeon. Now, tangentially related to this, we have a completely different category, which is dungeon order. This is actually quite the hot topic amongst the Zelda community. Is it better to have a mandatory dungeon order that the player has to go through to beat the game, or is it better to open up the world and let the player choose what order to go through the dungeons? But I'm not here to debate that, I'm just here to tell you which one occurs more frequently, and that is games that have a mandatory dungeon order. There are 13 Zelda games that have a mandatory dungeon order. Zelda 1 or Breath of the Wild are probably your best examples of what open-ended dungeoning looks like, where you can go to whichever dungeon you want to in whatever order, and you're not required to beat a dungeon before you go on to the next one. Regardless, next up we have magic. Defining magic meters in the Zelda franchise is a little complicated, so bear with me. The shortened version is, does Link have a meter that depletes when he performs certain actions? Now, this is pretty easy when you have games like Wind Waker or Ocarina of Time, where you have an actual magic meter, and when you use magic items, that goes down. Where this gets a little complicated is whether or not we include stamina as a magic meter, and I think we do, because it is a meter that depletes when you perform specific actions. The best way I can describe why I think these are basically the same thing as if we compare Breath of the Wild and Wind Waker. In both games, you have an item that lets you glide far distances, and the only factor that limits that, besides gravity, is the little green bar that represents how much magic or stamina you have. It may be called something different, but for all intents and purposes, it's the same thing, it's just that the actions have changed slightly. This might be controversial because based off of this definition, it's very tight, but 11 Zelda games have magic meters while 10 Zelda games do not have magic meters, which means that approximately half of these games get the point because of a definition battle. So tell me whether or not you agree with that in the comments. The next category we have is minigames. This is pretty simple. Does the Zelda game have a minigame or not? And the answer for most of them is yes. In fact, there's very few that don't. We have Zelda 2 and Four Swords. Even Zelda 1 has a gambling minigame, but I couldn't find a specific minigame in Zelda 2 that I could think of, and I definitely couldn't find a minigame in Four Swords. I thought about including the sub areas or challenge areas as minigames, but they play the exact same way as the rest of the game, so I don't think I would include those. Four Swords Adventure definitely has minigames though. Next up we have Steed. The definition is basically, is there something that Link has to ride on that lets him travel across areas that maybe he couldn't do it before, or just much faster across open areas? This is very simple yes for games that have like Epona or Loft Wings. Like those are obvious mounts, right? Where it gets a little more confusing is, does the King of Red Lions count as a steed? Or does the train in Spirit Tracks count as a mount? I think yeah, right? Like, they may not be alive per se. Well, I mean, the King of Red Lions is definitely a mount because he is alive. But trains they may not be alive, but they serve the same purpose, right? There's an area that you need the train to progress through, and you have to ride on it to get somewhere. I think it's a mount. I'm gonna call it a mount. Now, where this gets a little more complicated is, does the raft in Zelda 1 and 2 count as a mount by that same definition? Because you have to have the raft in order to get to the dungeon in Zelda 1, and you have to have the raft in order to get to the second continent in Zelda 2, but they function way more like items, I think. Because like the flippers aren't a mount, and they serve the same purpose. I don't know. I'm getting a little arbitrary with these definitions, but I'm just gonna go ahead and say that mounts are more common, and they appear in 11 Zelda games, which again, because of definitions, it gets a little dicey. So let me know if you disagree with my definitions. Now this brings us to our final portion of Zelda gameplay, items. The question becomes, does the Zelda game have items? Again, we're running into this issue where we need to define exactly what an item is. Now, every single game has items, depending on how you look at it. But the function that they serve and how they act within the Zelda game changes a lot. Because in most Zelda games, you collect items throughout the game, you keep them in your pack, and you pull them out and perform certain actions with it. Very simple. Even Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, you have the rune abilities, which act functionally the same as items. And if you're not including those, you have all kinds of items within your inventory that would count. The games that act differently would be Four Swords, Four Swords Adventure, and Triforce Heroes, because the way that you get items is very different. You don't collect them and then use them throughout the game. They appear on pedestals and you trade them out throughout certain levels. And in my mind, that's a big enough difference in gameplay that I'm gonna go ahead and say that those are not items. Like, they are items, but they're not the same kind of items. And because of this, that is going to be the majority. So all of the games that you collect items and use them from your inventory are going to be in one category, while the multiplayer games where you grab them from pedestals are going to be in a different category. Now for the results of the structure category. From lowest to highest, we have Four Swords, which includes 3 of these elements. Then we have Triforce Heroes, which includes 5 of these elements. Zelda 1, Adventure of Link, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom all include 6 of these elements. Then we have A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Four Swords Adventure, A Link Between Worlds, and Echoes of Wisdom with 7 of these elements. And finally, we have Ocarina of Time, Majora's Mask, Wind Waker, Minish Cap, Twilight Princess, Phantom Hourglass, Spirit Tracks, and Skyward Sword, which all have 8 of these elements. At the end of the video, we're going to be combining all of these categories with certain weights depending on how important each of these elements are to the overall Zelda experience. And luckily, we only have one more category to go before we get to that wrap up at the end of the video. So bear with me, we're almost there. The final thing that we can even try to compare across the Zelda games is the presentation of the Zelda game. This would include art style, story, and music. Now, you might say that this is impossible to compare because it's subjective. I understand that perspective, I really do. The Zelda series is known for its styles. It can be cartoonish and silly, it can be grounded and realistic, and this is a signature of the Zelda series. The fact that it changed in itself makes the Zelda series special. Even the music is designed to be different between each of the Zelda games in order to make you feel like you're having a completely different experience. Nobody wants these elements to be stagnant. These elements are what make Zelda so special. I hear you. I understand that perspective. I'm also ignoring you. We aren't here to celebrate diversity amongst the Zelda series. We're here for answers. I will find a way to quantify which Zelda game is the most Zelda game. Now, presentation falls into 3 categories: style, story, music. Because we're looking for the most Zelda game, we are looking for which ones occur the most, not which ones are the best. Because of this, when we're comparing style, we need to segregate these games into the styles that exist. For example, we have the first 2 Zelda games, which are 8-bit, which is one art style, and then we have A Link to the Past, which is 16-bit. Which is a different art style. You might argue that some of these graphics are just limitations of hardware and they were going for a different style, but I don't care. We're not trying to see what the artist wanted you to see. We're seeing what is presented to the player and what they experienced in the game. So the categories that we have are as follows: 8-bit, 16-bit, 3D low poly, Toon 3D, realistic 3D, 32-bit Toon 2D, low poly Toon 2D, whatever Skyward Sword is, high poly 2D, cell shaded 3D, and finally toy. And in case anyone is curious, no, we are not including remasters or remakes. The most common art style is 8-bit Zelda. This includes 5 different Zelda games, and the next most common would have been 32-bit Toon 2D, which includes 3 Zelda games. The next category we have is story. To be completely frank, for this list, I don't care what's in the story because art is subjective. And the only way we can compare it isn't how good the story is, it's how much of the story there is. So what we need to figure out is how long it takes to beat the story in a Zelda game. In order to do this, I made a list. I compiled all of the Zelda games and how long it takes to beat them, which I got from howlongtobeat.com. And then all we have to do is compile all of this information, find the average, and anything that is more than 1 standard deviation away from the average does not fall into the category. The average time it takes to beat a Zelda game is 21.47 hours. And then we have a 13.46 hour standard deviation. This means that any Zelda game that takes between 8 hours and 34 hours to complete falls into this category. This means that Zelda 1, Four Swords, Breath of the Wild, and Tears of the Kingdom are all disqualified. Now, the final question was supposed to be about music, and I started making a list to compare how often songs show up in the Zelda series, and then I realized that that was a horrible plan. Yeah, a lot of these songs have the same name, and I could have categorized them like that. But the fact of the matter is that there's so many reprises, allusions, and comparisons between songs that it's not even fair to try and categorize them by name, because sometimes you have the same song that has a different name, or you have the same name that's a different song. And because I wanted to protect the little sanity I have remaining after compiling all of these lists for hours, please subscribe. I just scrapped the music category. Everyone gets 1 point because they all have music. Koji Kondo knocks it out of the park. I love that man. This completes the presentation section. And this means we are going to be awarding the following rankings to all of the Zelda games. Breath of the Wild, Tears of the Kingdom, and Four Swords all have 1 point. Echoes of Wisdom, A Link Between Worlds, Skyward Sword, Spirit Tracks, Phantom Hourglass, Twilight Princess, Minish Cap, Four Swords Adventure, Wind Waker, Majora's Mask, Ocarina of Time, A Link to the Past, and Zelda 1 all have 2 points from this category. And then Oracle of Ages, Oracle of Seasons, Link's Awakening, and Adventure of Link all get 3 points from this category. This brings us to the end of the video where I promised that I would give you an answer for which Zelda game is the most Zelda. And I promised to do that. But first I want to say something. I may have meticulously gone through and written out all of the elements for every Zelda game. I may have spent hours on spreadsheets to prove my point. But the fact of the matter is, there's not a real answer to this question. No matter how you examine the question of what makes a Zelda game, you will never be able to come to an objective answer. We are people. We're created by our own biases and experiences. There's no real answer for what makes a Zelda game, because what qualifies a Zelda game as a Zelda game is determined by the individual. The impossibility of categorizing what makes a Zelda game is exactly what makes the series so special. The fact that Twilight Princess and Phantom Hourglass can exist in the same series is beautiful. The fact that Link can be left-handed or right-handed is amazing. The fact that some games focus on structure while other games focus on freedom is a good thing. Any person can find something they like in the Zelda series, and different people will find different things that they like in the Zelda series. And that is what makes a Zelda game a Zelda game. I much prefer the world where the developers of the Zelda series keep experimenting with Hyrule instead of us just getting clones of the same game over and over again. I'm glad that we have the original Zelda games. I'm glad that we have the awkward middle stages of Zelda games. I'm glad that we have new Zelda games. And I hope that it can continue in this direction and the developers keep experimenting and expanding what it means to be a Zelda game. But now that I've had my opportunity to present you with my perspective, I did promise that I would give you a definitive answer based off of the data that I collected. I hope that you can handle this information responsibly. The act of actually categorizing all of this data was a little tricky since some categories are more important than others. While trying to decide how these Zelda games should be ranked, I decided to give the following weight to these categories. Gameplay is by far the most important, so that will receive a weight of 4. The building blocks within a Zelda game would be the second most important, so we're going to be giving those a weight of 3. And then presentation being the least important about what makes a Zelda game will receive a weight of 1. We're going to take the number of points that each game got in each category and divide it by the total number of points they could have gotten in that category, which gives a percentage for each category. Then we're going to multiply that percentage by the weight and then add all of them together, giving us a numerical value for how Zelda each Zelda game is. And it gives us this final ranking from lowest to highest. In dead last place, we have Four Swords with 174.1 points, making Four Swords the least Zelda game, and honestly, yeah, that's fair. I think that's pretty fair. Then we have Triforce Heroes with 284 points. Breath of the Wild has 291.2 points. Tears of the Kingdom has 300.5 points. The Adventure of Link has 333.6 points. Zelda 1 on the NES has 334.7 points. Spirit Tracks has 350.6 points. Skyward Sword has 352.6 points. Phantom Hourglass has 366.1 points. Four Swords Adventure has 379.3 points. Twilight Princess has 386.2 points. Minish Cap has 389.5. Echoes of Wisdom has 410.4. Link's Awakening has 421.7 points. Wind Waker has 424.8 points. Majora's Mask has 429.8. Oracle of Ages has 430.1 points. Oracle of Seasons has 431 points. A Link Between Worlds has 450.3 points. A Link to the Past has 460.3 points. At number 1, we have Ocarina of Time with 462.4 points, making it the most Zelda game. Now, I do have to say, even though this list says that Ocarina of Time is the most Zelda game, I think that we can all in our hearts agree that Hollow Knight is the most Zelda game. We've got items, dungeons, steeds, magic. We have exploration. We have swords and enemies. Don't let the bugs distract you. This is just Adventure of Link if the developers knew what they were doing.